What if the person you look down on today is the one who holds your fate tomorrow? What if your assumptions about someone based on appearance blind you to the truth? This is a story of arrogance, prejudice, and a reckoning that no one saw coming. Stay with us until the end, because justice always finds a way. If you enjoy powerful stories about standing up against injustice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Now let's begin. Dr. Lisa Turner strode confidently through JFK Airport, her leather carry-on slung over her shoulder. She had taken this route many times, yet each journey still carried a sense of anticipation. As a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon, Lisa was heading to London for an international medical summit where she would be one of the keynote speakers. As she boarded the flight and made her way to seat 2A in first class, she found a woman already sitting there. Margaret Caldwell, an elegantly dressed middle-aged woman, looked up from her tablet, her eyes scanning Lisa from head to toe. A flicker of disdain crossed her face. Lisa offered a polite smile. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." Margaret arched a perfectly manicured brow. "Are you sure, dear? The first class is quite exclusive. Perhaps you should check your ticket again." Lisa pulled out her boarding pass. "Seat 2A. That would be right here." Margaret's lips curled into a smirk as she turned to a nearby flight attendant. "Miss, I think there's been a mistake." The flight attendant, a young woman named Emily, hesitated as she glanced between Lisa and Margaret. Lisa saw the indecision in her eyes, the silent calculation of race, class, and expectation. Emily sighed. "Mrs. Caldwell, Dr. Turner is indeed assigned to this seat." Margaret let out a short laugh. "Doctor? How interesting. But surely there must be another arrangement? I mean, I did pay quite a lot for my seat, and I'd rather not sit here." Lisa felt her fingers tighten around the handle of her bag, but she kept her voice calm. "There is no other arrangement, Mrs. Caldwell. Now, would you mind moving?" A few murmurs rose from other passengers in first class. A man in seat 1C, Richard Moore, a silver-haired executive, smirked and leaned toward Margaret. "You know, they do sometimes overbook these flights. Maybe she belongs in business class." Lisa exhaled slowly. "I assure you, Mr. Moore, my seat is exactly where it should be." Emily cleared her throat. "Mrs. Caldwell, please take your assigned seat." Margaret, still fuming, reluctantly moved to seat 2B, right next to Lisa. As she sat, she muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable." Lisa ignored her, but the moment had been noted by everyone in the cabin. The unspoken tension lingered. Just as Lisa was about to put on her headphones, two uniformed airport security officers stepped onto the plane. "Excuse me," one of them said. "We need to perform a random security check." Lisa frowned. "Random? Now?" The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, we'll need to check your carry-on." Lisa's eyes met Margaret's. The woman sat back with a smirk, watching with satisfaction. This wasn't random. This was targeted. A flicker of injustice burned in Lisa's chest, but she simply handed over her bag. She could play the long game, because she knew something that Margaret didn't. Karma always boards the same flight. Lisa sat stiffly as the security officer rifled through her carry-on. Every rustle of fabric, every shift of a zipper felt like a deliberate performance. Around her, passengers in first class watched with thinly veiled interest. Some, like Richard Moore, smirked. Others, like Margaret Caldwell, sat back in smug satisfaction. Lisa's jaw tightened. She had done nothing wrong. "Ma'am," the officer said, glancing up at her. "Do you have any sharp objects, liquids over the limit, or prohibited items?" Lisa exhaled slowly, maintaining her composure. "No. You're welcome to check thoroughly." She could see it now, the power play. A routine security check was performed only on her. A last-minute humiliation before takeoff. The second officer stood beside the first, hands on his belt, eyes scanning her as if expecting her to crack. Lisa knew their type. Men who enjoyed wielding power in the pettiest ways. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to remind herself that they couldn't break her. Not like this. The first officer finally zipped up her bag. "All clear," he said. Lisa reached for her bag, but he didn't hand it over immediately. Instead, he held it a second longer than necessary, eyes meeting hers. A silent challenge. Then, finally, he let go. "Enjoy your flight, Dr. Turner." His voice dripped with something between sarcasm and forced professionalism. Lisa held his gaze. "I intend to." The officers turned and exited the aircraft. As soon as they were gone, murmurs filled the cabin. "Just doing their job," Richard Moore said with an exaggerated shrug. "Some people always think they're being singled out." Lisa ignored him, but Margaret Caldwell leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough so that only Lisa could hear. "You should be grateful," Margaret murmured, eyes gleaming. "They're just making sure we're all safe." Lisa turned her head slowly, her lips curving into a tight, knowing smile. Margaret had made a crucial mistake. She thought Lisa was powerless. She wasn't. Lisa leaned in just as Margaret had, her voice steady. "Mrs. Caldwell, you do realize that in an actual emergency, I'd be the only one here qualified to save your life." Margaret's expression flickered, but only for a moment. Then she scoffed and turned away, pretending to be deeply invested in her tablet. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure. Lisa sat back, closing her eyes briefly. She had to focus. This flight wasn't worth her energy. As the plane taxied down the runway, Lisa felt a soft tap on her arm. She opened her eyes to find Emily, the young flight attendant from earlier, standing beside her seat. There was hesitation in her expression, guilt even. "Dr. Turner," she said quietly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about earlier. You didn't deserve that." Lisa studied her. The woman was young, maybe mid-20s, still figuring out where she stood in the world. Lisa gave her a small nod. "Thank you, Emily." Emily hesitated. "If you need anything, let me know." Lisa noted Margaret's slight stiffening beside her. Clearly, she had heard the exchange. Good. As the plane lifted into the sky, Lisa allowed herself a small, private smile. The real turbulence on this flight hadn't even begun. Lisa felt the hum of the aircraft beneath her as the plane reached cruising altitude. Outside, a sea of clouds stretched endlessly, but inside, the atmosphere was far from serene. The tension still lingered, thick and unspoken, like an invisible storm waiting to break. Margaret had barely looked at her since takeoff, though Lisa could feel the occasional sharp glance from the corner of her eye. Richard, in seat 1C, was engaged in quiet conversation with another passenger, an older gentleman who looked like he had stepped out of a Wall Street office. Every now and then, Richard chuckled, throwing a smug look on Lisa's way. She ignored it. Instead, she focused on the in-flight menu in front of her. A small act, but a deliberate one. She would not let them dictate how she carried herself. They would not get a reaction. Just as she reached for the call button to request a drink, Margaret sighed loudly beside her, shifting in her seat as though Lisa's very existence was an inconvenience. "I don't understand," Margaret muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "Airlines used to have standards." Lisa let out a slow breath. "Here we go. I beg your pardon," she said, her voice smooth but edged. Margaret gave a tight, rehearsed smile. "Oh, nothing personal, dear. It's just these days, first class isn't what it used to be. They let just about anyone in." Lisa closed her menu, placing it neatly on her tray. She turned, locking eyes with Margaret. "You mean people like me?" she said evenly. Margaret's smile faltered. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." The conversation around them quieted slightly. People weren't staring yet, but they were listening. Margaret huffed, as if she were the one being wronged. "I simply mean that first class used to be exclusive for a certain caliber of people. Professionals. Executives." Lisa tilted her head. And you assume I don't belong? Margaret waved a hand dismissively. I have no idea who you are, dear, but I know the kind of people who usually sit here. Lisa smiled, slow and knowing. Interesting, she mused. Because you do know who I am. I told you already, but let's pretend you didn't hear me the first time. She leaned slightly toward Margaret. I am Dr. Lisa Turner, cardiothoracic surgeon, head of the surgical department at New York Mercy Hospital. I save lives for a living. You know, the kind of person you might be begging to help you one day. Margaret stiffened. Lisa continued, her voice unwavering. So tell me again, Mrs. Caldwell, what kind of people should be in first class? A thick silence followed. Richard let out a small scoff from his seat. No need to be dramatic, doctor, he said lazily. She's entitled to her opinion. Lisa turned toward him. Oh, is she? Richard smirked. Sure. Just like you're entitled to play the victim card whenever it suits you. There it was, the not-so-subtle accusation. Lisa's grip on the armrest tightened, but before she could respond, a sharp gasp erupted from across the aisle. A middle-aged man, seated in 3B, suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorted in pain. His breathing grew ragged, his hands shaking. The murmurs started immediately. Flight attendants rushed forward, their voices laced with urgency. Sir, are you all right? The man shook his head, barely able to respond. His skin was pale, his forehead damp with sweat. It was a heart attack. Lisa's instincts kicked in instantly. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. I'm a doctor, she announced. I need space. Margaret went rigid. Beside her, Richard, who had just belittled Lisa moments ago, now looked uncertain. The flight attendants hesitated before stepping aside. Lisa kneeled beside the struggling man, checking his pulse. Weak, unstable. She turned to the nearest attendant. I need access to the medical kit. Now. The woman nodded and ran toward the galley. Lisa's hands moved quickly, assessing his condition, knowing every second counted. She didn't have time for anyone's bias anymore. The only thing that mattered now was saving a life. The tension in the cabin had shifted, but it had not disappeared. Lisa could feel it, the weight of unspoken words, the fragile pride of those who had misjudged her. Margaret Caldwell sat in silence, her hands still trembling as she recovered from the medical emergency. She had been humbled, but not broken. Lisa had seen this before. People like Margaret didn't change overnight. And neither did men like Richard Moore. From across the aisle, Richard shifted in his seat. His arms were crossed, his mouth drawn into a thin line. Unlike Margaret, who now sat in embarrassed silence, Richard still burned with indignation. He couldn't stand the fact that Lisa had proven them all wrong. Lisa sensed it before he even opened his mouth. He wasn't done. Impressive, Richard finally said, his voice casual but laced with something sharper underneath. Lisa didn't react. Richard leaned slightly toward her row, voice lowering just enough so only she and Margaret could hear. But I have to wonder, was it all just a bit of luck? Right place, right time? Lisa finally turned her head, meeting his gaze. Luck? Richard shrugged. I mean, let's be honest. How often does someone like you get to sit in a seat like this, let alone save a life while doing it? Lisa's fingers tightened slightly against the armrest. Not out of anger, but out of sheer exhaustion. Men like Richard never learned. He continued, his smirk widening. Or maybe it's just convenient. Right when someone questions if you belong, you suddenly become the hero. That's quite the story, don't you think? Lisa studied him carefully. He wanted a reaction. She wouldn't give it to him. She let the silence hang for a few beats before speaking. Well, Richard, she said slowly, I suppose it was convenient for Margaret that I was here. Margaret flinched slightly at the mention of her name. She kept her eyes forward, unwilling to engage. Richard chuckled. Oh, I'm sure she's grateful. But let's not pretend this changes everything. You're still just He stopped himself, but Lisa already knew what he had been about to say. "You're still just a black woman in first class." Lisa's lips curled into a smile. "You should really think carefully about what comes out of your mouth next, Richard." The amusement flickered from his face. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the conversation. Lisa leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Because I guarantee you, I've worked 10 times harder to sit in this seat than you ever have." Richard's jaw tensed. Lisa didn't look away. "And the next time someone like me is on this plane, maybe you'll remember today and think twice before opening your mouth." Richard's fingers drummed against the armrest, his smirk faltering. But before he could reply, another voice interrupted. Emily, the young flight attendant, approached with a forced polite smile. "Mr. Moore," she said firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice." Richard scoffed. "Excuse me?" Emily's smile didn't waver. "I've been asked to inform you that if you continue harassing another passenger, you'll be reported to the airline's conduct board upon landing." Richard's face darkened. "This is ridiculous." Lisa didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't acknowledge his outrage. Because she had already won. Richard muttered something under his breath and turned away, staring out the window. Emily gave Lisa the slightest nod before stepping away. Lisa exhaled, finally allowing herself to sink into the silence. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. 30 minutes before landing, a different flight attendant approached Lisa. She looked nervous. "Dr. Turner," she said hesitantly, "I was asked to pass along a message." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "A message?" The attendant swallowed. "From Mr. Moore." Lisa sighed. "Let me guess. He wants to explain himself." The woman hesitated before shaking her head. "No. Actually, he asked to speak with you privately after we land." Lisa stilled. "Richard wanted a private conversation?" She glanced across the aisle. Richard was no longer smirking. His expression was unreadable. Lisa weighed her options. Was this an attempt at an apology? Or was he planning one final insult before they parted ways? Either way, she wasn't about to back down. She met the flight attendant's gaze. "Tell him I'll think about it." As the plane began its descent, Lisa looked out the window, her reflection staring back at her. This flight was almost over. But the reckoning? That was still to come. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway at Heathrow Airport, but the tension in first class was anything but settled. Lisa unbuckled her seatbelt, her mind already shifting to her upcoming medical conference, but she couldn't ignore the impending confrontation. Richard Moore wanted to talk. Privately. Lisa had agreed, not because she expected an apology, but because she knew men like him never walked away quietly. He had lost control of the situation, and now he wanted to regain it. As the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their belongings. Margaret still sat quietly beside Lisa, not making eye contact. She had no more words left. Lisa doubted she would ever forget this flight, but that wasn't Lisa's concern anymore. A flight attendant approached her. "Dr. Turner, Mr. Moore is waiting for you near the jet bridge." Lisa exhaled. "All right." She grabbed her carry-on and stepped into the aisle, ignoring the lingering glances of first-class passengers who had witnessed everything. As she exited the plane, she spotted Richard standing near a window overlooking the tarmac. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. Lisa approached but kept her distance. "You wanted to talk?" Richard turned, studying her for a moment, before speaking. "I don't like losing." Lisa smirked. That much was obvious. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Look, I don't expect you to care, but I built my career on knowing how to read people. And today I misread you." Lisa folded her arms. "You misread me, or you assumed something about me based on the color of my skin?" Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. "I've been flying first class for years. I've seen the type of people who sit in those seats. And, well, you didn't fit the mold." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "And now that I've saved a life, I do?" Richard scoffed. You think you're proving a point, but all you did was reinforce a different truth. People like you have to be exceptional just to be treated like equals. Meanwhile, people like me? He let out a hollow chuckle. We get to be mediocre and still have a seat waiting for us. Lisa blinked. That was the closest thing to self-awareness she had ever heard from a man like Richard. She tilted her head. Is that your way of apologizing? Richard let out a bitter laugh. No, it's my way of telling you that today pissed me off more than you think. Because if I have to acknowledge that you deserved your seat just as much as I did, then I have to acknowledge that many other people I've ignored might too. Lisa stared at him for a moment before shaking her head. That's not a revelation. That's just reality. Richard looked past her for a moment, watching as the last few passengers left the aircraft. His arrogance wasn't gone, but it had cracked, revealing something else beneath it: discomfort. Lisa adjusted the strap on her carry-on. So what happens now? You go back to pretending none of this ever happened. Richard let out a slow breath. I don't know, but I do know that the next time I see someone like you in first class, I might think twice before assuming they don't belong. Lisa gave him a knowing look. Good. That's how change starts. She turned to leave, but before she walked away, she glanced over her shoulder. One last thing, Richard. You may not like losing, but trust me, today you didn't lose. Richard frowned. What do you mean? Lisa smiled. Because today you actually learned something. She didn't wait for his response. As she walked through the airport, leaving behind the turbulence of that flight, she felt something settle in her chest. She hadn't just won a battle. She had planted a seed. Some people would never change. But others? Maybe, just maybe, they would. And that was enough. Lisa strode through Heathrow Airport, her steps purposeful, her mind still replaying the encounter with Richard. He wasn't a changed man, at least not yet, but something in him had shifted. Whether it would last was another story. She glanced at the departure screens, double-checking the gate for her connecting flight to Geneva, where the medical conference was being held. As she turned toward the lounge, a voice stopped her. Dr. Turner? Lisa turned, finding Emily, the young flight attendant from the flight, standing a few feet away. She looked nervous, but determined. I just wanted to thank you again, Emily said. Not just for what you did for Mrs. Caldwell, but for how you handled everything. Lisa gave her a measured look. You don't have to thank me. Emily hesitated. Actually, I do. You probably don't know this, but when Margaret complained about you, the crew was debating whether or not to ask you to move. Lisa's jaw tightened. Even though I was in the right? Emily swallowed hard. Yes, because sometimes it's easier to accommodate people like her than to deal with the fallout. Lisa crossed her arms. And what changed? Emily gave a small smile. The captain. When he recognized you, the discussion stopped. No one wanted to risk upsetting someone important. Lisa let out a dry laugh. So my credentials saved me? Emily nodded, looking ashamed. I know how that sounds. Lisa sighed, shaking her head. I don't need people to respect me because of my title. I need them to respect me because I'm a human being. Emily nodded. I get that, and I hate that it took today for me to really see it. She hesitated, then added, I'm going to report what happened to my supervisor. The way you were treated before and after you saved a life, it wasn't okay. And I don't want to be part of an industry that lets that slide. Lisa studied the young woman's face. She saw something she hadn't seen in Richard. Real conviction. That's how change happens, Lisa said. Not just with grand gestures, but with small choices. Emily smiled. I'll remember that. Lisa gave her a small nod before turning to leave. But as she walked away, she heard Emily call after her. For what it's worth, Dr. Turner, you belong in first class more than anyone I've ever seen. Lisa didn't turn back, but she allowed herself a small smile. She was about to step into the lounge when another voice, this one deeper, familiar, caught her attention. Lisa? She turned and blinked in surprise. James Holloway, one of the most renowned neurosurgeons in the world, stood before her. Dressed impeccably in a navy suit, he looked as polished as ever. "What are you doing here?" Lisa asked, genuinely surprised. James grinned. "Same as you. I'm heading to Geneva for the summit. But I heard about what happened on your flight." Lisa narrowed her eyes. "How?" James chuckled. "You underestimate how fast news spreads in our circles. Let's just say, a lot of people in high places are very interested in the woman who saved a life mid-flight after being treated like she didn't belong there." Lisa exhaled. "Great. Just what I needed, more attention." James gave her a knowing look. "Lisa, this isn't just a story. This is a conversation starter. People need to hear about what happened." Lisa crossed her arms. "And what? Turn it into some headline about the hero doctor overcoming discrimination in first class." James' expression grew serious. "Or turn it into a discussion about who gets to be seen as belonging. About how many people don't have the luxury of proving themselves the way you did." Lisa fell silent. James placed a hand on her shoulder. "Look, you don't have to decide now. But if you want to do something with this, if you want to make people listen, you have more allies than you think." Lisa nodded slowly. Maybe Richard wasn't the only one who needed to think twice about what had happened on that flight. Maybe the world did too. Lisa sat in the back of the car, staring out at Geneva's glowing skyline. The conversation with James Holloway still echoed in her mind. This wasn't just about her anymore. The story of what happened on Flight 118 had ignited something bigger, a reckoning that some people weren't ready for. Her phone buzzed. Rebecca's name flashed on the screen. Lisa picked up. "Let me guess, more media requests?" "You wish," Rebecca said, her voice tight. "We have a problem." Lisa frowned. "What kind of problem?" Rebecca sighed. "Margaret Caldwell just filed a formal complaint against you with the airline." Lisa's stomach tightened. "You're kidding." "I wish I was," Rebecca muttered. "She's claiming you publicly humiliated her on the flight, and that you made her feel unsafe. And get this, she's hired a lawyer." Lisa closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe. Of course Margaret wouldn't go down quietly. "She's trying to flip the script," Rebecca continued. "Her legal team just issued a statement to a few media outlets saying she was verbally attacked by another passenger and that she suffered extreme emotional distress as a result." Lisa let out a short, humorless laugh. "So now she's the victim?" "Oh, it gets worse," Rebecca said. A right-wing media outlet ran an article about it. Headline reads, "Well-respected socialite harassed by doctor in first class. Has wokeness gone too far?" Lisa's grip tightened around her phone. It was predictable. It was infuriating. And yet, she wasn't entirely surprised. "She's trying to control the narrative," Lisa muttered. "She knows what really happened, but she also knows people will believe whatever version benefits them the most." Rebecca's voice sharpened. "Exactly. And she's playing to the crowd that thinks people like her are the real victims in today's world. The rich, privileged victims who can't handle being called out." Lisa's mind raced. If Margaret had filed a complaint, then the airline would have to investigate. This wasn't just about one woman throwing a tantrum anymore. It was about power and perception. If Margaret succeeded in twisting the facts, Lisa could end up being the one under scrutiny. She exhaled sharply. "What's the airline saying?" "They haven't made a decision yet," Rebecca said. "But from what I hear, they're getting pressure from both sides. Some passengers on the flight are backing you. Others are staying quiet, probably because they don't want to get involved." Lisa clenched her jaw. Cowards. They had seen everything. They had witnessed Margaret's contempt, Richard's mockery, the blatant bias Lisa endured before she ever spoke a word. And now, some of them were too afraid to take a stand. "What's our move?" Lisa asked. Rebecca hesitated. "We go public first." Lisa blinked. "You think we should leak it before the airline responds?" I think we make sure they can't brush it under the rug, Rebecca corrected. We release a statement on our terms. We don't just defend you. We turn this into what it really is, a pattern. This isn't about one flight. This is about who gets to belong in spaces like first class, who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. Lisa thought about it. If they stayed quiet, Margaret's version of events would gain traction. And even if the airline eventually ruled in Lisa's favor, damage would already be done. She took a slow breath. All right, draft the statement. Already on it, Rebecca said. But Lisa? Yeah? Rebecca's voice softened. I know this is exhausting, and unfair, and absolute bullshit. But if we do this right, this won't just be another news cycle. It'll be a turning point. Lisa didn't respond right away. She looked out at the city, her reflection faintly visible in the car window. Margaret was fighting like hell to hold onto her power. But Lisa had something stronger, the truth. And she was done letting people like Margaret rewrite it. Lisa sat in her hotel room, her laptop open, staring at the news reports flooding in. The battle for the truth had officially begun. Margaret Caldwell's legal team had moved fast, spinning the story into a misunderstanding-turned-witch hunt. Their latest statement painted Margaret as a frail woman who had been unfairly vilified, accusing Lisa of using the situation for personal gain. Lisa wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of move privileged people made when faced with consequences. They tried to rewrite reality. Her phone buzzed. Rebecca. Lisa answered. Tell me you have something. Oh, I have something, Rebecca said, her voice laced with satisfaction. A video from one of the passengers. Lisa sat up straighter. What kind of video? One that destroys every lie Margaret has told. Lisa clicked the link Rebecca sent. The video started with Margaret sneering as Lisa stood beside her seat. Are you sure you're in the right place? Margaret's voice was unmistakable. The condescension, the smirk, it was all there. The footage continued, capturing every single moment. Margaret demanding Lisa be moved. Richard joining in, making it about standards. Lisa being singled out for a so-called random security check. The exact second when Margaret fell ill. And Lisa, the woman she had humiliated, saved her life. Lisa exhaled slowly. The entire world was about to see what really happened. This is it, she murmured. This is the proof. Rebecca's voice was electric. I already sent it to the airline's legal team. They can't ignore this, Lisa. They're going to have to act. Lisa knew she was right. This wasn't just a claim anymore. This was undeniable evidence. But before Lisa could reply, another call came in, this time from an unknown number. Hang on, Rebecca, she said, switching the line. Hello. A deep, measured voice responded. Dr. Turner, this is Christopher Hayes, General Counsel for the airline. We've just received disturbing footage regarding an incident on Flight 118. Lisa smirked. Oh, now it's disturbing? We are currently in emergency deliberations regarding Mrs. Caldwell's behavior, Hayes continued, his voice carefully diplomatic. We take matters like this very seriously. Lisa leaned back in her chair. You take them seriously now. But when I was the one being humiliated, your airline had no problem staying silent. There was a pause. Dr. Turner, I understand your frustration. No, Lisa cut in. You don't understand my frustration. But you're about to. Another pause. Then Hayes cleared his throat. We will be issuing an official response within the next 24 hours. I assure you, this will be handled appropriately. Lisa's lips pressed together. I'll be watching. She hung up and switched back to Rebecca's call. So? Rebecca asked. Lisa exhaled. They're panicking. Rebecca chuckled. Good. Lisa closed her laptop, her mind already on the next step. The truth was out. Now it was time for consequences. Lisa woke up to the persistent buzzing of her phone. It wasn't even dawn yet, But the world wasn't waiting. She rubbed her eyes, reached for her phone, and saw the notification that mattered most. "Rebecca, check your email. It's happening." Lisa quickly opened her inbox, her heart pounding slightly. There it was, an official statement from the airline. Official airline statement. Incident on Flight 118. After a thorough internal review, including multiple passenger testimonies and newly surfaced video footage, we have determined that Mrs. Margaret Caldwell engaged in conduct that violated our airline's code of ethics. Effective immediately, Mrs. Caldwell has been permanently banned from all future flights with our airline. We do not condone discrimination of any kind, and we regret that Dr. Lisa Turner experienced an unacceptable breach of our standards. Additionally, we are implementing new measures to ensure incidents like this do not occur in the future, including mandatory bias training for all employees and a review of our security screening procedures. Lisa read the words twice, letting them settle in. Margaret Caldwell, banned for life. It had actually happened. A woman who had spent her life moving through the world unchecked, untouched by consequences, had finally been held accountable. Lisa exhaled a slow, measured breath. This was justice, but was it enough? Her phone buzzed again. Rebecca calling this time. Lisa picked up. "So that's it, huh?" Margaret gets grounded. Rebecca scoffed. Grounded? More like publicly exiled. Social media is eating this up. People are calling it a first-class reckoning. Lisa let out a humorless chuckle. One woman gets banned, and now the world thinks the problem is solved. Rebecca sighed. "Look, I get it. This doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't stop it from happening again. But it sends a message. People like Margaret don't get to do this without consequences anymore." Lisa stared out the hotel window, the morning sun just beginning to streak across the sky. She wanted to believe that. She really did. But deep down she knew the truth. Margaret Caldwell was just one person. For every Margaret, there were 100 others who thought like her, who acted like her, who would continue treating people like Lisa as if they didn't belong. And most of them would never get caught on camera. Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You think this is enough? That banning one woman from flying changes anything?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then her voice softened. "No, but it's a start." Lisa knew she was right. This wasn't about Margaret Caldwell anymore. This was about who got to feel safe in spaces like first class, and who had to prove they belonged. And Lisa Turner was done proving herself. She took another breath, steadied herself, and spoke with quiet certainty. "Then let's make sure it doesn't end here." Rebecca smiled on the other end of the line. "I thought you'd say that." Lisa stood backstage at the International Medical Summit in Geneva, staring at the polished podium just a few feet away. She had been preparing for this keynote for months, crafting a speech about advancements in neurosurgery, the future of medical technology, the kind of work that had built her career. But when she stepped onto that plane a few days ago, she hadn't expected to land in the middle of a cultural reckoning. Now her story had been plastered across news outlets, debated on talk shows, and dissected in online forums. Some people called her a trailblazer. Others dismissed her as just another person playing the race card. And Margaret Caldwell? Her name had become a symbol, a cautionary tale of what happens when unchecked privilege finally meets consequence. Lisa adjusted the microphone, took a slow breath, and began. "When I first sat down to write this speech, I planned to talk to you about medicine," she said, her voice calm, steady. "But something happened to me recently that reminded me of an even bigger responsibility we all share, inside and outside of the operating room." A hush fell over the crowd. They knew exactly what she was talking about. She continued, "I boarded a flight expecting nothing more than to get from one city to another. I had my ticket, my seat, my credentials. And yet, before I even opened my mouth, there were people who decided I didn't belong." She glanced at the audience, letting the words settle. And when the time came, when a woman who looked down on me needed help, I didn't hesitate. Not because she deserved it, not because she had earned my kindness, but because doing the right thing should never be determined by who we think is worthy. The room was silent. Listening, Lisa leaned forward slightly. This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about a question we need to start asking ourselves. Who do we automatically see as belonging? And who do we force to prove it? She let that sink in before continuing. Some people think this story is over because one airline banned one woman from flying. But that's not how change works. Real change isn't about punishing one person. It's about fixing the system that allowed her to act that way in the first place. A few nods rippled through the crowd. They understood. Lisa took a breath. This isn't just about first class on an airplane. This is about boardrooms, classrooms, hospitals, offices, and every other space where people like me still have to fight to be seen as equal. It's about making sure the next generation doesn't have to save a life just to be respected. A pause. Then she smiled. So, my question to you is this: what are you going to do about it? Silence. Then applause. Slow at first, then rising into something deafening. Lisa stepped back from the podium, her heart steady. She had said what needed to be said. As she walked off stage, a young black girl, no older than 10, rushed up to her wide-eyed. "Dr. Turner," the girl asked softly, "I saw you on the news. My mom said you're really brave." Lisa knelt to meet her at eye level. "Your mom is a smart woman." The girl hesitated. "I want to be a doctor too." Lisa smiled, warmth filling her chest. "Then don't ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong." The girl grinned. "I won't." Lisa stood, watching as the girl and her mother disappeared into the crowd. The end. If you believe in standing up for what's right, in holding people accountable, and in making sure no one has to prove their worth just to be treated with respect, then let's keep this conversation going. Like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge the way we see the world.